Hi there and welcome back for our next video for APUS history. Today we're going to be discussing the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. I'm your APUSH Lady Boss and I'm excited to guide you through this information. If you would like to follow along with some guided notes, go ahead and check down in the description and you can grab the link there. So main thing that we want to focus on here is the learning objective, explain the causes and effects of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. So what's really important to note is that you don't actually really need to know what happened during the 7 Years' War. It's the causes and effects. And this objective is very similar to most every war in American history. So what we're seeing happening in period 3 is a shift in the relationship between the colonies and Britain. And so this moment, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, this is the spark, this is the turning point in that relationship. So as you read through the objectives, what you're going to notice is that we see an expansion of conflict, that there's conflict between Britain and France. We see conflict between American Indians, and we eventually see conflict between Britain and the colonists. And so really these objectives are all about, or these key concepts are all about the shifting relationships that are happening in North America. So as always, we're going to start with historical context. We're going to go into the causes of the war, briefly discuss the course of the war, and end with the effects. So historical context, what you want to know is that this isn't an isolated event, that the French and Indian War is the fourth in a series of conflicts between European nations, primarily Britain, France, and Spain. And all of these wars are going to work together to incur a lot of debt for Great Britain. And so that's a key idea that you want to be aware of. A lot of these wars are fought in part for increased territory and trading rights, especially in North America. And as this territory is exchanged, as we see boundaries adjust, we see that the American Indians in North America will have to shift alliances or partake in these wars because they are part of those alliances. So let's dig into it, the causes of the war. What's really happening is we're centered on the Ohio River Valley. This is where there's a very productive fur trade happening. And the French believe that they are in control of this land, and so they are building forts to prevent British expansion. However, the British do not want the French to have this control, and so they're going to respond to these forts being built with violence. So we're really looking at economics as the main catalyst for war. However, religious differences are also going to play a role in the causes of war. So at the outset of the war, it's important to be aware of the alliances. As you can see here, the French are going to have many more American Indian alliances than the British. And one major reason for that is because of the initial settlements. You go back to our lesson in Unit 2 where we looked at how the French and the Native Americans were more likely to become trading partners, form solid alliances, intermarry, live together. Those are all characteristics of the French, whereas the British mostly lived separate. And it's not to say that the French were completely peaceful, but those alliances that they developed did end up playing a major part of this war. So what happens at the beginning of the war is that George Washington, just 22 years old, and an Iroquois chief, Tanagrisson, led a small militia to Fort Duquesne. They actually have a small victory here because they surprise the French with this attack at dawn. But then they retreat back and create a fort called Fort Necessity, and that ends up being defeated pretty quickly. So pretty soon, what we see happening is calls for colonial unity. The British want the colonies to coordinate the war effort, and so 7 colonies are going to send delegates to Albany, New York. Now, Benjamin Franklin is going to create what's called the Albany Plan of Union. And if agreed upon, this Albany Plan of Union would form a Grand Council, and that Grand Council would be in charge of an intercolonial government that could make laws. It would include a system for recruiting troops and a process for collecting taxes. But the plan never took effect because the colonies really value their independence. They don't want to be forced to send troops. They don't want to have to pay for this war. They see, especially some of the more southern colonies, see this as a British problem. So, why do we pay attention to this plan then? Why should you be aware of the Albany Plan of Union? Well, I think that there's 2 parts. Almost every video you'll watch about the Albany Plan of Union will tell you it's a precursor to future Congresses in the Revolutionary War. And sure, that is true. It is a precursor to what we see happening as the colonies unite against Britain. However, they miss the important factor here that this plan was developed with Iroquois alliances, with their Iroquois allies there. And it shows how their confederation, their system of alliances with other Native American tribes, that shapes values and ideas about American democracy and federalism that show up in the Revolutionary period as well. And so that's a really important thing to note. And this famous image was created by Benjamin Franklin. Maybe you've seen it before, but it's showing our different colonial regions. The New England colonies are New England, so you'll only see 8 parts of the snake here instead of 13. And also Delaware was still considered to be part of Pennsylvania at this time. So the message here is join or die. Now, a lot of students, when they get to May, they see this and they think, oh, it's Revolutionary War. The colonies have to join together against Britain. But that is wrong. What you need to remember is that this is join together. Colonies unite with Britain against France. So don't get that mixed up. This cartoon is one that many students, they just don't pay enough attention to, and they get those specifics mixed up. So the events, as I mentioned, this isn't really anything that you would be tested on in an AP curriculum, but just for some background information, the formal declaration of war didn't follow. It followed after 2 years of Washington's attack on Fort Duquesne, but the war really erupted all over the world. There were some pretty major early losses for the British, but then some battles in Louisbourg and Quebec and Montreal turned the tide, and eventually the French will surrender. So the last thing that I want to address for the course of the war is kind of the differing perspectives of how the colonies participated in the war effort. The British viewed the colonies really poorly. They thought that they took a very long time to be trained, and even then they were disorderly and not effective. They were very frustrated that not all the colonies participated in the war effort, either by sending troops or money, and they were very convinced that the colonists were unable and unwilling to defend the new frontier. These attitudes absolutely play a role in the events that happen following the French and Indian War. Now, the colonial view is they were very proud of the militia. They believed that they had defended their territory well against the French. They grew their confidence, and they were not impressed by the British leadership. And so you can see how these views would have an impact when the Revolutionary War movement begins to emerge. So let's get to the effects here. The first effect is going to be our Treaty of Paris, also known as the Peace of Paris, 1763. There are multiple treaties of Paris's that you will need to know for APUS history, so make sure you pay attention to the date on this. And the biggest thing that you'll see as part of the Treaty of Paris is the change of territory. As you can see, French claims are gone. There is a shift of some land to Spain and some to the British, and also Spain cedes Florida to the United States. So now the United States is going to control a huge amount of land up into the Mississippi River. Now, there is significant debt for the British Empire as a result of all four wars, but especially the 7 Years' War. And because of that debt, we see a shift in the British colonial policies. If you remember salutary neglect, this is the policy where the British basically ignored their own navigation acts, where they allowed the colonists to engage in trade as they saw fit. And so they're going to end that practice and start increasing their their observation of the navigation laws. Those won't really be talked about in this unit, but the adoption of increased taxes and the enforcement of those taxes is what will be especially shocking to the colonists. We also will see the continued presence of British troops in America. So then the last effect that you really need to be familiar with is going to be increased conflict with American Indians. And the one that you want to be aware of is called Pontiac's Rebellion. And so what we see here is a massive pan-Indian alliance, unprecedented resistance to European colonization. A group, an alliance of many different American Indian groups are angry over the changes that have happened as of the French and Indian War. The French used to partake in their gift-giving ceremonies before trade would occur, and the British refused to do this. The British colonists are now encroaching on lands that have been controlled by American Indians. And so Ottawa Chief Pontiac leads this massive rebellion against the British colonists. I also want to note that there was a Delaware prophet, Neolin, who had a vision from the Master of Life, and Pontiac had a similar one, where these visions demonstrated that the American Indians had become too dependent on Europeans and that they should get rid of gunpowder and go back to bow and arrow, return to a more traditional way of life. And so these values, these visions, they inspired other Native Americans to kind of forego their issues with each other and work together against the British. Now, the British Army will be sent in to put down the uprising, and this is where we see a biological warfare taking place, taking blankets and handkerchiefs from a hospital that had smallpox in it and giving those intentionally to American Indians. They cruelly killed even those American Indians that weren't in rebellion. And so here is a quote from Chief Pontiac. "It is important for us, my brothers, that we exterminate from our lands this nation which seeks to destroy us." So just a quick little quote from Chief Pontiac about what they were trying to do here. So what are the effects of the war? Here's the final one for you. In connection to the increased conflict with American Indians, we see the British pass what's called the Proclamation of 1763. And this is creating this imaginary red line around the 13 colonies that prohibit the colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains in hopes that it would prevent future conflicts with American Indians. They don't want to have to keep their military there to continue to put down American Indian uprisings because it's expensive and the British are already in debt. The colonists, however, desired to gain the economic value from this new territory. They fought in this war. They're helping to pay for this war. Shouldn't they have the benefit of the war, which is the territory? And so many are going to defy the order. And one group in particular was called the Paxton Boys. This is a white supremacist group that perpetuated racial violence against American Indians. They decided that the best way to solve the issue was actually to get rid of all Native Americans. And so they launched attacks on Americans in the area and brutally murdered them. So that wraps up our topic 3.2. Hopefully you feel really confident about being able to explain the causes and effects of the 7 Years' War. And if so, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.